He thought she was just another inexperienced attorney. Judge Arthur Coleman watched with thinly veiled contempt as Olivia Prescott stood before his court in her simple beige sweater. "Are you actually prepared to handle this case?" he mocked, expecting her to crumble. But when she began speaking, quoting precedents only seasoned lawyers would know, his smug smile vanished. This simple woman wasn't who she appeared to be, and she was about to teach him a lesson he'd never forget. The morning sun filtered through the windows of Olivia Prescott's apartment as she stood before her mirror, methodically transforming herself. At 38, she was one of Boston's most formidable civil rights attorneys, with a reputation that preceded her in courtrooms across New England. Today, however, she wasn't dressing for success. She pulled her normally styled hair into a simple bun, removed her signature pearl earrings, and traded her tailored suit for a modest beige sweater and simple black pants. She even switched her designer frames for an older, more subdued pair. "This has to work," she whispered to herself, studying her reflection. She thought back to the research she'd done on Judge Arthur Coleman. For 15 years, he'd presided over the Suffolk County Court with an iron fist and notorious bias. Corporate cases almost always swung in favor of big business, especially when argued by female attorneys, whom he seemingly viewed as less competent by default. 3 months ago, Olivia had been approached by representatives from Riverside Gardens, a retirement community housing primarily lower-income seniors. Westlake Development had set their sights on the property, intending to build luxury condominiums. Through dubious means and legal loopholes, they were close to forcing out dozens of elderly residents. The case had already been before Judge Coleman once, presented by a high-profile attorney who'd been practically laughed out of court. That's when Olivia had been called in. But she knew appearing as herself wouldn't work. "If he sees another polished Harvard attorney walking in, his mind will be made up before I speak," she had explained to her colleague, Marcus. Marcus had been skeptical. "So, your plan is to, what? Pretend to be inexperienced? Olivia, that's risky. If he finds out, I'm not going to lie," she had clarified. "I'm just not going to correct assumptions. I've just moved to this jurisdiction. He doesn't know me yet." Now, as she gathered her deliberately worn leather briefcase, she mentally reviewed the strategy. Today wasn't about winning outright. It was about laying groundwork, getting Coleman to underestimate her. Then, when the time was right, she would reveal her true capabilities. Olivia's phone buzzed. A text from Gloria Winters, the 78-year-old resident who had become the face of Riverside Gardens' fight. "We're all counting on you, dear. God bless." Olivia took a deep breath. She wasn't just fighting for a legal victory. She was fighting for people's homes, their dignity, their community. At the courthouse, she blended in with the crowd, nothing about her commanding attention. Several attorneys nodded politely but distantly as she passed, none recognizing her as the same Olivia Prescott who had successfully argued before the Supreme Court 2 years prior. Inside the courtroom, she spotted the opposition, 3 Westlake attorneys in impeccable suits, led by Richard Daniels, known for his aggressive tactics and deep corporate connections. He barely glanced at her as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. "Are you the paralegal?" he asked dismissively. "I'm representing Riverside Gardens today," she replied simply. Daniels smirked, turning back to his colleagues with a poorly concealed chuckle. His body language screamed, "This will be easy." Gloria and 5 other elderly residents filed in, sitting directly behind Olivia. Gloria squeezed her shoulder. "Thank you for taking this on, Miss Prescott. We couldn't afford another big-name lawyer after the last one." Olivia smiled reassuringly. "Sometimes the unexpected approach works best." The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Arthur Coleman." Coleman entered, his tall frame and silver hair giving him a commanding presence. His eyes, cold and assessing, swept over the courtroom before he took his seat. He shuffled papers for a moment before looking up, his gaze landing first on Daniels and his team with something like collegial recognition. Then his eyes shifted to Olivia, narrowing slightly. "I see we have new counsel for the plaintiffs," he remarked, making no effort to mask the skepticism in his voice. "Let's hope we don't waste the court's time today." Olivia maintained a neutral expression, knowing the performance had already begun. She had studied 16 of Coleman's previous cases involving housing disputes. She knew his tendencies, his biases, and, most importantly, his blind spots. "Your Honor," she said, making her voice just slightly less confident than her usual courtroom tone. "We're prepared to proceed." Coleman looked at her over his reading glasses. "Are you? We'll see about that." Richard Daniels presented his case with the polish of a corporate attorney who'd never lost a night's sleep over the human cost of his victories. His argument was smooth, well-rehearsed, and laden with legal terminology designed to impress. "Your Honor, Westlake Development has followed every regulation to the letter. The zoning change was approved by the City Council. The property's current use is simply no longer economically viable," Daniels concluded with practiced sincerity. Judge Coleman nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, Mr. Daniels. Clear and concise, as always." He then turned to Olivia, his expression shifting to one of thinly veiled impatience. "Ms. Prescott, your response?" Olivia stood, deliberately arranging her notes with slightly fumbling fingers, a small performance for her audience of one. She noticed Coleman checking his watch. "Your Honor," she began, her voice steady but lacking the commanding presence she typically brought to courtrooms. "Riverside Gardens has been home to over 60 senior citizens for more than 20 years. The residents have legal leases that—" "Ms. Prescott," Coleman interrupted, "I'm well aware of what a lease is. What I need are legal arguments, not emotional appeals." Several of the Westlake attorneys smirked, exactly as Olivia had anticipated. "Of course, Your Honor. I apologize," she said, appearing slightly flustered. "The residents contest the validity of the zoning change on the grounds that proper notification procedures weren't followed." Coleman sighed audibly. "And your evidence for this claim?" "We have affidavits from residents stating they never received the legally required notices," Olivia responded, sliding documents forward. "Affidavits can be prepared by anyone, Ms. Prescott. Do you have anything substantive?" Daniels interjected. "Your Honor, we have signed receipts showing all notifications were delivered as required by statute." Coleman nodded. "Indeed, Ms. Prescott, this seems like a straightforward matter of documentation which your clients lack." Olivia hesitated, deliberately, then pressed on. "Your Honor, there's also the matter of the historical significance of the property, which would require additional review before redevelopment." The judge removed his glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose. "Ms. Prescott, is this your first major case?" The courtroom fell silent. Even Daniels looked uncomfortable at the direct confrontation. "I've handled various matters, Your Honor," Olivia answered truthfully, if incompletely. "I thought as much," Coleman said with evident condescension. "Let me explain something," Coleman continued, leaning forward with a patronizing tone that echoed through the quiet courtroom. "Perhaps in law school they told you that passion counts for something in court. It doesn't. Evidence does, precedent does, and so far you've presented me with neither." The elderly residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Gloria's face had fallen. "Now," Coleman continued, "do you have actual legal arguments to present, or shall we end this exercise?" Olivia remained standing, absorbing the humiliation without visible reaction. This was the moment she'd expected. Coleman putting her in her place, establishing dominance, showing everyone that a simple-looking woman couldn't possibly challenge the system he represented. "Your Honor," she began, her voice soft, "may I have a moment to confer with my clients?" Coleman waved his hand dismissively. 2 minutes, then I'm making my ruling." As Olivia turned to speak quietly with Gloria and the others, Daniels leaned back in his chair, already wearing the expression of a victor. Coleman shuffled papers, barely concealing his boredom. "Don't worry," Olivia whispered to the seniors. "This is proceeding exactly as expected." Gloria looked doubtful. "But he's not listening to anything you say." "He will," Olivia assured her. "Just trust me." When she turned back to face the court, Olivia allowed a subtle shift in her posture, straightening just slightly, squaring her shoulders in a way almost imperceptible to anyone not looking for it. "Your Honor," she said, her voice carrying the same unassuming tone, "I'd like to present evidence regarding docket 62B, the property's classification under municipal code." Coleman frowned. "The defendant has already addressed the zoning issues." "Not zoning, Your Honor. Historical preservation eligibility under the Williams precedent." A flicker of confusion crossed Coleman's face. "Williams?" "Williams v. Northeastern Development, 2008. The Third Circuit established that buildings housing predominantly elderly populations for over 20 years qualify for expedited historical review, even without prior designation. Coleman's eyes narrowed. This wasn't the fumbling he'd expected from her. That case isn't relevant here, Daniels cut in quickly. Olivia kept her eyes on Coleman. If I may explain the relevance, Your Honor? Coleman studied her for a moment, curiosity replacing some of his dismissiveness. Proceed, Ms. Prescott, but be quick about it. The first tiny crack had appeared in his armor of certainty, and Olivia was just getting started. Williams established that elderly housing carries special consideration due to the vulnerable nature of the population and the disproportionate harm caused by displacement, Olivia continued, her voice growing incrementally more assured. She pulled a document from her worn briefcase. I've prepared a brief on Williams and 3 subsequent cases that reinforce this precedent. Coleman accepted the document with visible reluctance. Ms. Prescott, I'm familiar with housing law. If this were applicable, surely Mr. Daniels would have addressed it. Perhaps Mr. Daniels hoped it wouldn't be raised, Olivia suggested, maintaining her unassuming demeanor while inserting the first hint of her actual confidence. Daniels stood, his previous smugness faltering. Your Honor, Williams was a narrow ruling specific to Pennsylvania properties. It has no bearing on Massachusetts law. Olivia didn't miss a beat. Actually, Your Honor, the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court cited Williams favorably in Geller v. Boston Housing Authority just last year. Page 47 of the ruling specifically extends the principle to all New England states. Coleman flipped through the brief, his brow furrowing as he located the reference. The courtroom remained silent as he read, the atmosphere shifting perceptibly. Furthermore, Olivia continued while he read, Riverside Gardens meets all 5 criteria established in Geller for emergency preservation status. She pulled another document from her briefcase. I've outlined these points along with supporting documentation. Coleman looked up, studying Olivia with new interest. The patronizing smile had vanished. You seem surprisingly versed in preservation law, Ms. Prescott. I find it's an overlooked area in housing disputes, Your Honor, she replied modestly. For the next 30 minutes, Olivia methodically presented her arguments, each one revealing a deeper knowledge of precedent and statute than the last. She cited cases that even Coleman, with his 15 years on the bench, had to strain to recall. She referenced local ordinances with specific subsection numbers from memory, all while maintaining the appearance of someone who was simply well-prepared rather than expertly strategic. The elderly residents behind her began sitting straighter in their seats. Gloria's face showed dawning hope. Across the aisle, Daniels conferred urgently with his colleagues, papers shuffling as they scrambled to address points they clearly hadn't anticipated. Your Honor, Daniels interjected during a brief pause, we request a short recess to review Ms. Prescott's claims. Coleman, still studying Olivia with puzzled interest, nodded. 15 minutes. As Coleman stood to leave the bench, he added, Ms. Prescott, I'd like to see counsel in my chambers. The courtroom buzzed with whispers as Olivia and Daniels followed the judge into his wood-paneled office. Coleman closed the door and turned to them, his expression guarded. Mr. Daniels, were you aware of these precedents? Daniels cleared his throat. We examined relevant case law, Your Honor, but considered these particular cases distinguishable from the current situation. Distinguished how? Coleman pressed. Ms. Prescott's analysis of the parallels seems quite thorough. Olivia remained silent, watching the dynamic shift. Coleman, who had dismissed her completely an hour ago, was now using her work to challenge Daniels. Daniels straightened his tie. With all due respect, Your Honor, Ms. Prescott is overlooking key differences in property valuation and municipal interests. I'm not overlooking them, Olivia interjected calmly. I've addressed them in Section 3 of my brief. The Harvard Law Review article by Professor Abernathy specifically refutes the valuation argument in similar cases. Coleman raised an eyebrow. Harvard Law Review. You're familiar with Abernathy's work? Yes, Your Honor, she replied simply. Coleman studied her with increasing curiosity. Ms. Prescott, where did you study law? The moment had arrived sooner than she'd expected. Olivia met his gaze directly. Harvard, Your Honor. Class of 2008. Daniels blinked in surprise. Coleman's expression remained unreadable. And your practice? You're new to my courtroom. I recently relocated to this jurisdiction, Previously, I practiced in Boston, primarily handling civil rights and housing discrimination cases. Coleman leaned back against his desk. Any cases I might recognize? Olivia allowed herself a small smile. Perhaps Prescott versus Department of Housing and Urban Development. The change in Coleman's expression was subtle but unmistakable. Widened eyes, a momentary parting of lips. He knew that case. Everyone in legal circles did. It had gone to the Supreme Court 2 years ago and established new precedent for fair housing enforcement nationwide. "You're that Olivia Prescott?" he asked, disbelief coloring his voice. "Yes, Your Honor." Daniels looked between them, confusion evident on his face. Coleman straightened, his professional demeanor returning. "Let's get back to court. I believe we have matters to discuss." When court resumed, the atmosphere had transformed. Judge Coleman's demeanor toward Olivia had shifted from dismissive to warily respectful. He no longer interrupted her, instead listening intently as she continued her presentation. "Your Honor," Olivia began, her voice now carrying more of its natural authority, "I'd like to introduce Exhibit C, the original community charter for Riverside Gardens." She approached the bench, handing over a document that looked significantly older than the others. This charter, established in 1972, includes a covenant that explicitly protects residents from displacement for commercial development. Coleman examined the document carefully. "This appears to be a private agreement, Ms. Prescott. Its enforceability against new ownership would be questionable." "Under normal circumstances, I would agree," Olivia responded, a hint of her usual courtroom confidence now evident. However, in Latimer v. Crescent Development, the Massachusetts Supreme Court held that such covenants remain enforceable when incorporated into the original property deed, which this one was. She produced another document. The covenant was registered with the county as Addendum B to the property deed. "I've highlighted the relevant language." Daniels stood abruptly. "Your Honor, we were never provided with this document during discovery." Olivia turned to him calmly. "It was included in the second document production, Mr. Daniels. Page 147 of the attachment to our response dated March 15th. Judge Coleman raised an eyebrow. "Is that correct, Mr. Daniels?" The corporate attorney faltered, quickly conferring with his team. One of his associates nodded reluctantly, sliding a folder toward him. Daniels' expression soured as he located the page Olivia had referenced. "It appears it was included, Your Honor," he admitted. By now, the entire courtroom was watching the proceedings with rapt attention. The gallery had filled with additional spectators, word having spread that something unusual was unfolding in Coleman's courtroom. "Ms. Prescott," Coleman said, studying her with newfound interest, "you mentioned earlier that you've recently relocated to this jurisdiction. May I ask what brought you to this particular case?" It was a deviation from the legal arguments, a personal question that judges rarely asked in open court. But Olivia recognized it for what it was. Coleman trying to understand who she really was and why she'd presented herself as she had. "I believe everyone deserves equal protection under the law, Your Honor," she replied, "particularly those who might otherwise be overlooked by our legal system." "Such as elderly residents facing corporate development interests," Coleman observed. "Exactly, Your Honor." Coleman nodded slowly, then turned to Daniels. "Counselor, how does Westlake respond to this covenant issue?" Daniels straightened his tie, visibly thrown off balance. "We maintain that subsequent zoning changes supersede the original covenant, Your Honor. Furthermore, the economic interests of the city—" "The economic interests," Olivia interrupted with quiet intensity, "do not outweigh the legal rights of these residents." Her posture had completely transformed now. She stood tall, her voice resonant with conviction. "Ms. Prescott," Coleman said, "you've presented a remarkably thorough case today. One might wonder why such understated presentation initially." The courtroom held its breath. This was Coleman acknowledging what had happened, his own dismissal of her based on appearances. Olivia met his gaze directly. "Your Honor, I've found that in life, as in law, people often see what they expect to see. These residents," she gestured to Gloria and the others, "are dismissed because they're elderly, on fixed incomes, not dressed in expensive clothes. Their legal rights remain, regardless of appearances." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Coleman's expression flickered between discomfort and admiration. Sometimes, Olivia continued, the only way to demonstrate such bias is to experience it firsthand. Coleman leaned back, understanding dawning in his eyes. You deliberately presented yourself this way. I focused on the legal arguments, Your Honor. How those arguments were initially received was educational. Daniels, sensing the shift in momentum, tried to regain control. Your Honor, while Ms. Prescott's theatrics are interesting, they don't change the legal reality that— Mr. Daniels, Coleman interrupted, his tone sharp. I would reconsider characterizing counsel's approach as theatrics. The legal arguments Ms. Prescott has presented are substantive and merit serious consideration. Olivia suppressed a smile. The transformation was complete. For the record, she said, reaching into her briefcase, I'd like to submit my credentials and bar admissions to this court. She handed the documents to the clerk. Including my role as lead counsel in Prescott v. HUD and 7 other federal cases pertaining to housing rights. Coleman nodded, accepting the documents. So noted, Counselor. The title was deliberate, a professional acknowledgement he had withheld earlier. The message was clear to everyone present. Judge Arthur Coleman now saw Olivia Prescott for exactly who she was. Judge Coleman cleared his throat, the courtroom silent as he prepared to deliver his ruling. The transformation in his demeanor toward Olivia was apparent to everyone present. Gone was the condescension, replaced by professional respect. Based on the arguments and evidence presented today, I'm issuing a preliminary injunction against Westlake Development's planned eviction of Riverside Gardens residents, he announced. The covenant issue raised by Ms. Prescott presents significant legal questions that must be resolved before any development can proceed. Relieved gasps and muffled cheers came from the elderly residents. Gloria wiped tears from her eyes, reaching forward to squeeze Olivia's shoulder in gratitude. Furthermore, Coleman continued, I'm ordering an independent review of the zoning change process based on the evidence suggesting proper notification. Procedures may not have been followed. He fixed Daniels with a stern look. The court takes very seriously any potential irregularities in proceedings affecting vulnerable populations. Daniels stood, composure faltering. Your Honor, this delay will cost my client millions. Your client's financial concerns do not override legal process, Mr. Daniels. Coleman interrupted firmly. Perhaps that's something Westlake should have considered before pursuing this particular property. As Coleman concluded the proceedings, setting dates for further hearings, Olivia gathered her materials calmly. The contrast between her simple appearance and commanding legal presence now seemed to fascinate rather than mislead those watching. Outside the courtroom, reporters had gathered, word having spread about the unexpected turn of events. Olivia guided the elderly residents through the crowd, deflecting questions with practiced ease. Ms. Prescott, called one persistent reporter, is it true you deliberately downplayed your credentials to expose judicial bias? Olivia paused. I presented the legal arguments necessary to protect my clients' homes. How those arguments were received initially versus after my experience became known is something I'll leave for others to reflect upon. As they walked toward the courthouse steps, Judge Coleman emerged from a side door, clearly heading to his next appointment. Seeing Olivia, he hesitated, then changed direction to approach her. Counselor, he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. That was an effective demonstration. Olivia met his gaze evenly. Thank you, Your Honor. I wonder, he continued, how many other attorneys have stood before me with valid arguments that I've overlooked due to similar assumptions. That's not for me to say, Judge Coleman, Olivia replied. He nodded solemnly. No, but it's certainly for me to consider. He glanced at the elderly residents waiting nearby. You've given them a fighting chance. The law gave them that chance, Olivia corrected gently. I simply ensured it was recognized. Coleman studied her for a moment longer. I look forward to seeing you in my courtroom again, Ms. Prescott, though perhaps next time there will be less need for strategic presentation. With a brief nod, he continued on his way, the encounter unnoticed by the busy courthouse crowd. Gloria approached, her eyes bright with tears of relief. You did it, Olivia. You actually did it. Olivia smiled, placing an arm around the older woman's shoulders. This is just the beginning, Gloria, but today we made them see you, really see you. As they descended the courthouse steps together, Olivia reflected on the day's events. She had entered that courtroom knowing exactly what would happen, how she would be dismissed, underestimated, nearly humiliated. But she had also known that sometimes the only way to change a biased system was to expose it from within. Today in Judge Coleman's courtroom, justice hadn't just been served in the legal sense. A deeper truth had been revealed, that worth and capability had nothing to do with appearance, and that assumptions, even from those in positions of authority, could be profoundly wrong. In the weeks that followed, Olivia's victory at Riverside Gardens became a talking point in legal circles throughout the state. Judge Coleman, true to the moment of reflection he'd shared with her, began earning a reputation for more equitable treatment of all attorneys appearing in his court. As for Olivia Prescott, she continued her work, sometimes in designer suits, sometimes in simple sweaters, but always with the same brilliant legal mind and unwavering dedication to justice. That morning, as she prepared for another case, she paused before her mirror. The woman who looked back at her wasn't defined by her clothes or appearance. Her strength came from something far more significant: her knowledge, her compassion, and her unwillingness to let anyone's preconceptions stand in the way of justice. With a satisfied smile, she picked up her briefcase and headed out, ready for whatever challenges awaited. If this story moved you, remember that appearances rarely tell the whole truth about a person's capabilities or worth. Share your thoughts in the comments below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us how perception and reality don't always align, and how courage and intellect can change even the most entrenched systems when given their moment to shine. Until next time, remember, never judge a book by its cover, especially in a courtroom. Sometimes the simplest appearance can hide the most extraordinary talent, and those who are too quick to dismiss others based on how they look may find themselves learning a powerful lesson in humility. Have you ever been underestimated because of appearances? Or perhaps you've witnessed someone else triumph despite being overlooked. Your stories inspire us to keep sharing these important moments of truth and justice.